Welcome back. Today, we bring you Clara's powerful story, an experience that changed her life forever and carries a message for all of us. But before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming life-changing stories. Now, let's hear directly from Clara as she shares her incredible journey. My name is Clara, and for as long as I can remember, my life revolved around my phone. It wasn't just a tool for staying connected. It was my escape, my comfort, and, ironically, the source of my deepest insecurities. Nights like this one were common. Me sprawled across the worn-out sofa in my parents' living room, scrolling endlessly through Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. The glow of the screen lit up the dimly lit room, and the faint hum of the television in the background provided a kind of white noise that helped drown out my thoughts. That night was no different, except for an inexplicable tension that lingered in the air. My parents had already gone to bed, their muffled voices barely audible from their room down the hall. My younger siblings were asleep too, their dreams undisturbed by the light of the world I carried in my hand. It was just me, the cold December wind rattling the windows, and the endless stream of curated lives on my screen. I didn't notice the hours slipping by. The likes, comments, and perfectly edited snapshots of strangers' lives were like a drug, numbing and intoxicating. Yet, deep inside, I felt a growing emptiness, the kind of hollowness that gnawed at you, even in a room full of distractions. I tried to push it away, telling myself it was just another late-night funk, but the feeling clung to me. Suddenly, a wave of dizziness washed over me. It was as though the room tilted and my vision blurred. I thought I had stared at the screen for too long, or maybe forgotten to eat dinner. Just get up, grab some water, I told myself, but as I tried to rise, everything around me went black. This was the beginning of something I could never have prepared for. A journey that would shatter everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies beyond. As the darkness enveloped me, a strange calm washed over my panic. It wasn't like fainting, where there's confusion and fear in the moment. This felt different. My body no longer obeyed me, yet I was acutely aware of everything. Sounds around me grew faint, like a distant echo, until all I could hear was the rhythmic pounding of my own heartbeat. Then even that faded, leaving an eerie silence. I blinked, or at least I thought I did, and suddenly I wasn't in the living room anymore. I hovered above it, weightless, staring down at a scene that made my stomach churn. There I was, slumped on the couch, my phone still glowing in my hand. My head tilted awkwardly, my breathing shallow. The sight was jarring, as though I were watching a stranger. I tried to scream, to shake myself awake, but nothing happened. My thoughts raced. Am I dead? Is this what happens when you die? Fear gripped me, cold and unrelenting. My mind clung to every possible explanation. Maybe I was dreaming, or perhaps I had passed out and this was some kind of hallucination. But deep down, I knew this was real. Then, the room around me began to change. The furniture dissolved into shadows, and the walls melted away, leaving a vast, empty void. I wasn't floating anymore. I was falling, though there was no ground to hit. My heart pounded as panic gave way to despair. Was this the end? Was this how it all ended? Alone, in the dark, disconnected from everyone and everything? Suddenly, a brilliant light pierced the void, cutting through the darkness with an intensity I'd never experienced. It wasn't just a light. It was warmth, clarity, and something I could only describe as love. It wrapped around me, pulling me toward its source. And then I heard it, a voice, clear and commanding, yet gentle enough to quiet the storm of fear inside me. Clara, it called, and I froze. The sound of my name spoken like that was unlike anything I'd heard before. It wasn't just a sound. It was a call, a pull, a knowing. Whatever was happening, I couldn't turn away. The light grew brighter, almost blinding, yet it didn't hurt my eyes. Instead, it filled me with an overwhelming sense of peace, as though all the questions and doubts I had carried for years no longer mattered. And then, stepping out of the light, was a figure. He wasn't what I expected, not the stereotypical image of divinity from the paintings in Sunday school. He was both radiant and humble, commanding and gentle, his presence exuding authority but also deep compassion. "Clara," the figure said again, his voice resonating through the void, touching not just my ears but my very soul. "You are not where you are meant to be, not yet." I stared, frozen, my thoughts a chaotic swirl of awe and confusion. Who are you?" My voice trembled, though I wasn't sure if I spoke aloud or if he simply understood my thoughts. "I am Emmanuel," he replied, his gaze steady, penetrating. "I have come to show you what you must see." I felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, curiosity, and a sense of unworthiness. "Why me? I'm just me," I stammered. "I don't even believe in all this." Emmanuel's expression softened, a hint of sorrow flickering across his face. "You are not chosen because you are perfect, Clara. You are chosen because you are loved." Before I could process his words, he extended his hand toward me. It glowed with the same light that surrounded him, and though I hesitated, something deep within me urged me to reach out. The moment our hands met, the void around us transformed. We stood in a vast expanse filled with screens of every kind: phones, tablets, TVs, even VR headsets, all glowing eerily. But there was something sinister about them. Dark tendrils snaked from the devices, wrapping around invisible forms. Faces appeared on the screens, their eyes blank and lifeless. "What is this?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the hum of the screens. "This," Emmanuel said, his tone heavy with sorrow, "is the battlefield." The screens stretched endlessly into the horizon, floating in midair like suspended mirrors. Each one pulsed with a faint, otherworldly glow, casting shifting shadows across the void. But what struck me most were the tendrils of darkness that snaked out from each device. They writhed and coiled like living things, wrapping themselves around unseen figures. As I squinted closer, the shapes became clearer. People, millions of them, their faces turned toward the screens, their expressions blank, their eyes devoid of life. Emmanuel gestured toward the scene, his voice calm but tinged with urgency. "This is where the enemy fights the hardest, Clara. Through these, he seeks to enslave hearts, minds, and souls." I turned to him, my thoughts racing. "But it's just technology, entertainment. How can it be this dangerous?" He turned his gaze back to the screens, his expression grave. "It was never meant to be this way. Technology was created to be a tool, to aid and connect. But the enemy twists what is good into chains. Look closer." I hesitated, then stepped forward, drawn to a screen larger than the others. As I peered into its depths, I saw chains emerging from the glowing surface. They weren't just metaphorical. They were real, binding wrists, necks, and even hearts. Each chain bore a word: comparison, anxiety, lust, distraction, pride. The sight of it made my chest tighten, as though I could feel the weight of those chains myself. "They don't even know they're chained," I murmured, horror dawning on me. "They think they're free." "That," Emmanuel said, his voice filled with sorrow, "is the enemy's greatest deception. To enslave them without their knowledge." The screens began to shift, their glow intensifying as red flames flickered at the edges. Symbols appeared, burning bright and ominous, etched onto the screens and searing into the foreheads and hands of the entranced figures. I recoiled in shock. "What is that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "It is not yet the mark," Emmanuel replied, his tone grave, "but it is conditioning them to accept it. The enemy prepares their hearts to value convenience, approval, and instant gratification above all else. When the time comes, they will accept the mark without question." His words struck me like a thunderclap. My mind raced, replaying all the hours I had spent scrolling, the times I had compared myself to others, the moments I felt worthless because of a comment or a like, or the lack of one. It wasn't just others who were chained. I was too. I turned to Emmanuel, tears brimming in my eyes. "What can I do?" I whispered. "How can I stop this?" Emmanuel placed a hand on my shoulder, his touch steadying me. "First, you must see more. There is still much to understand." Emmanuel waved his hand, and the screens shifted again. The tendrils of darkness grew thicker, twisting like massive ropes. The chains now seemed heavier, pulling the people down. Their faces, once only blank, began to show pain. Silent cries that pierced my heart, though no sound escaped their lips. The words inscribed on the chains became sharper, brighter, as if seared into their very beings. Fear, isolation, greed, hopelessness. I couldn't look away, though every second of it tore at me. "These are the conditioned," Emmanuel said, his voice a blend of sorrow and resolve. "They are not merely using these devices, they are being used by them." As I watched, I saw glimpses of their lives. A man sitting at a dinner table, his family surrounding him, but his eyes glued to his phone. A woman scrolling through social media, tears streaming down her face as she compared herself to the filtered lives she saw. A teenager in bed, the glow of a screen illuminating their room as loneliness seeped into every corner. These were scenes I recognized. They weren't strangers. They could have been anyone, even me. But why don't they stop? I asked, my voice breaking. Why don't they see what's happening? "Because the chains are invisible to them," Emmanuel replied. "The enemy keeps them blind, whispering lies that these devices are essential to their happiness, their worth, their identity. And so, they cling to their chains, mistaking them for lifelines. Suddenly, the chains began to tighten, and the people's pain grew. I gasped as I saw one figure fall completely, crushed under the weight. "This isn't fair," I said, turning to Emmanuel, anger and despair welling up in me. "They don't even know they're trapped. How can they fight back if they don't even see the battle?" "They cannot fight alone," Emmanuel said, his gaze meeting mine. "That is why you must tell them. Help them see what you now see." Before I could respond, the screens turned a fiery red again. This time, the glow intensified, and symbols blazed even brighter on the people's foreheads and hands. It was as though the devices were branding them, leaving marks that could not be erased. "Emmanuel," I whispered, fear gripping my heart. "What is that mark?" He sighed, a heaviness in his voice. "It is the precursor," he said, "a shadow of what is to come. They are being prepared, Clara, trained to value convenience over conviction, approval over truth. The time will come when the mark is offered, and many will accept it without question, believing it to be their salvation." A wave of despair crashed over me. How can anyone escape this? I asked, tears streaming down my face. "It feels inevitable." "It is not," Emmanuel said firmly. "But the chains must be broken now, before it is too late." His hand rested on my shoulder again, and the warmth of his touch steadied me. "You are beginning to understand, but there is more to see." The scene began to shift once again, the glowing red fading as a new, equally heartbreaking vision began to take shape. The red glow of the screens faded, and in its place, I found myself standing on what looked like a battlefield. But this wasn't a war fought with weapons. It was something far more insidious. On one side were families, parents, grandparents, children, and teens. The divide between them was stark, like an invisible wall separating the generations. They weren't fighting together. They were fighting against each other. The older generation shouted angrily, their faces contorted with frustration. "You're lazy, addicted. You don't care about anything important anymore," their voices rang out. They waved phones and tablets in their hands as if they were symbols of everything wrong with the world. Their accusations struck like arrows, aimed directly at the younger generations. The younger ones retaliated, their own voices rising with defiance. "You don't understand us. You created these problems. You left us to deal with a broken world and now blame us for trying to cope." Their words were sharp, laced with pain and anger, their gestures pointing at the screens that surrounded them. I turned to Emmanuel, confused and heartbroken. Why are they like this? They're supposed to be a family, a community. Why are they tearing each other apart? "The enemy sows division," Emmanuel said solemnly. "It is one of his most effective weapons. He turns them against each other, so they cannot fight against him. By focusing on blame and resentment, they lose sight of the real battle." As I watched, the scene grew darker. The figures on both sides became shadows of themselves, consumed by their anger and frustration. In the distance, I saw another figure, a dark, menacing presence lurking in the shadows. Its laughter echoed faintly, chilling me to the core. It was enjoying the chaos, thriving on the discord. "What can they do?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How can they fix this?" "They must wake up," Emmanuel said, his voice filled with both hope and urgency. "The older generations must see that their children and grandchildren are under attack, not by them, but by something far greater. They must fight for them, not against them. And the younger generations must understand that the wisdom of the past is not their enemy. They need each other." The vision shifted slightly, and I saw some of the older figures put down their devices, stepping toward the younger ones. Their expressions softened as they extended their hands. The younger ones hesitated at first, but then they reached back. The wall between them began to dissolve. "But not all of them will do this," Emmanuel warned. "Some will remain blind, clinging to their distractions, their pride, their anger. But even if a few wake up, it will make a difference. You must tell them, Clara. You must help them see." I nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in my mind. Could I, a teenager with no power, no voice, really make a difference? Emmanuel's gaze met mine, as though he could hear my thoughts, and the warmth of his confidence in me steadied my resolve. "Come," he said. "There is still more you need to understand." The battlefield dissolved, and I found myself standing in a place I recognized but had never seen like this before: a church. It wasn't a small chapel or a grand cathedral, but an average sanctuary, much like the one I attended as a child. Rows of pews stretched out before me, filled with people of all ages. The pastor stood at the pulpit, preaching passionately, his words echoing through the room. But something felt wrong. At first, I couldn't figure out what it was. Then I noticed the glow, the unmistakable blue-white glow of screens. Nearly everyone in the congregation was staring at their phones. Some scrolled absent-mindedly, others took selfies, while a few recorded parts of the service for social media. The scene made my chest tighten. Even the children, who once would have fidgeted in boredom or drawn on bulletins, now had tablets in their tiny hands. "This is my house," Emmanuel said, his voice trembling with both sorrow and anger. "But it has become a marketplace for distractions." I watched as the pastor's words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He spoke of faith, love, and the need for spiritual renewal, but no one seemed to hear him. Even those who appeared to be paying attention had their phones in hand, glancing down every few moments as notifications buzzed. The glow of the screens cast an artificial light across the sanctuary, drowning out the warm, natural light that filtered through the stained glass windows. "Why don't they care?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Why come at all if they're not even listening?" "They have forgotten why they are here," Emmanuel replied, his gaze heavy with sadness. "They seek entertainment, validation, and convenience. Their hearts are divided, their focus pulled in too many directions. They have lost the ability to seek me with their whole hearts." I noticed a small group in the corner, older members of the congregation, their faces lined with worry. They weren't distracted by devices, but their posture spoke of weariness. They prayed quietly, their lips moving without sound, their hands clasped tightly. They looked out over the room, watching the younger generations with a mixture of concern and resignation. "There is still hope," Emmanuel said, gesturing toward the small group. "Some still seek me, some still pray, but they cannot fight this battle alone. The distractions are too great, the pull of the world too strong. They must show others the way." My heart ached as I looked around the room. I wanted to scream, to grab the phones from their hands, to shake them and make them see what I saw. But I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I turned to Emmanuel, tears streaming down my face. "What can I do?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I'm just one person." Emmanuel placed his hand on my shoulder, his touch grounding me in the midst of my despair. "You are more than you think you are, Clara. You are my messenger. I will give you the words. You must give them the truth." The sanctuary faded, and I was left standing in the void once again, a renewed sense of purpose stirring in my heart. As the church faded into the void, I found myself standing face to face with Emmanuel once more. The warmth of his presence steadied me, yet the weight of what I had seen hung heavy on my shoulders. My mind reeled with questions, doubts, and fears. How could I, a single person, make a difference against something so vast and overwhelming? "I'm just a kid," I said, my voice breaking. "No one will listen to me. They'll think I'm crazy." Emmanuel's gaze softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and unwavering determination. "They thought I was crazy too," he said gently. "Many rejected me, even those closest to me. But some listened, and their lives were changed. Some will hear you, Clara. That is all that matters." His words stirred something deep within me, a flicker of hope, though still faint. But what can I even say? How can I make them understand what I've seen? It's so much. "You will speak boldly," Emmanuel replied. "You will tell them the truth, as you have seen it. Warn them of the chains, the battlefield, the conditioning. Show them the consequences of their choices and the hope of redemption. It will not be easy, but you are not alone." I looked into his eyes, searching for answers, for strength, for a reason to believe I could carry out what he was asking of me. His presence was a steadying force, and though the fear lingered, it didn't overwhelm me. "How do I even begin?" I asked. Emmanuel stepped closer, placing both hands on my shoulders. "Start with your own life," he said. "Break free from your chains. Let them see the difference in you. And when the time comes to speak, the words will come." For a moment, we stood in silence, the weight of his message sinking into my heart. The void around us began to shift, and I felt a pull, subtle at first, then stronger. My time here was ending, and I could feel the tether to my body growing taut. "I'll try," I said, my voice trembling but resolute. "I don't know if I can do it, but I'll try." Emmanuel smiled, a warmth radiating from him that filled every part of me. "That is all I ask, Clara. Go now and remember. You are loved, you are chosen, and you are capable of far more than you believe." As the void began to fade, I felt a surge of emotions: fear, hope, sadness, and resolve. I didn't know what awaited me on the other side, but I knew that my life would never be the same. Emmanuel's voice echoed softly as the light around me dimmed. Warn them and trust that I will guide you. And then, with a jolt, I was back. With a gasp, I bolted upright, my chest heaving as though I had been underwater for hours. The room around me was dim, the familiar glow of the television casting flickering shadows on the walls. My phone lay on the floor across the room. Its screen cracked as if it had been thrown. My body felt heavy, like I'd been carrying an invisible weight for years, and now it had settled fully on my shoulders. I clutched my chest, trying to steady my breathing. My head pounded, my vision still blurry, but I was alive. The realization hit me like a wave, bringing with it a flood of emotions. Relief, confusion, and an overwhelming sense of urgency. Clara. My mom's voice broke through the haze, frantic and full of worry. She rushed into the room, her face pale as she knelt beside me. What happened? Are you okay? I tried to speak, but my voice caught in my throat. How could I possibly explain what I had just experienced? How could I put into words the visions, the chains, the battlefield, Emmanuel? Instead, I just nodded, tears streaming down my face. I think you fainted, she said, brushing my hair back from my damp forehead. You're burning up. We need to get you to a doctor. I'm okay, I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure if I believed it myself. I need a moment. She hesitated, her worry evident, but eventually she relented. All right, but if you don't feel better soon, we're going to the hospital. No arguments. As she left to get me water, I sat there in the silence, the events of the night replaying in my mind. My hand trembled as I picked up my phone, its once alluring glow now feeling cold and alien. I stared at the screen, the cracks a stark reminder of the chains I had seen, the chains I now realized had been binding me too. I set the phone down gently and closed my eyes, a quiet prayer forming in my mind. Help me, I whispered. Help me figure out how to do this. The weight of Emmanuel's words pressed on me, not as a burden, but as a call, a mission I couldn't ignore. I didn't know where to begin, but for the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling that my life had shifted irreversibly. Every moment, every interaction seemed to carry a new significance. Even the mundane felt heavy with meaning, as if the veil between the physical and the spiritual had been lifted just enough for me to glimpse the battle raging beneath the surface. The phone, once an extension of my hand, now felt like a stranger. I avoided it as much as I could, though its presence was inescapable in the world around me. My siblings would sit at the dinner table, their faces illuminated by screens as they scrolled mindlessly, the way I once had. My parents, though critical of our habits, were no better, checking emails, reading the news, or playing games on their devices. Everywhere I looked, I saw the chains Emmanuel had shown me. I knew I couldn't keep silent, but the thought of speaking up terrified me. How could I tell my family, my friends, even strangers, about what I had seen? How could I make them believe me? The fear of rejection and ridicule loomed large, but so did the memory of Emmanuel's words. You are more than you think you are. You are my messenger. It started small. I began setting limits for myself, choosing to spend more time with my family and less time staring at a screen. I joined my mother in prayer, something I hadn't done in years, and found myself pouring out my heart to God, asking for strength, wisdom, and courage. Slowly, I began sharing my story, first with my closest friend, then with others. Each time, the reactions varied. Some dismissed it, some were moved, and a few even seemed to awaken, as if a light had been sparked within them. At school, I noticed classmates who seemed lost in the same cycles I had been trapped in. Instead of judging them, I reached out, offering a listening ear and gentle encouragement. The words came easier as time passed, and I realized that I wasn't speaking alone. Emmanuel's guidance was with me, shaping my message. The most unexpected change, however, was within my own heart. Where once there had been doubt, anger, and insecurity, there was now a growing sense of peace and clarity. I wasn't perfect. I still stumbled, still felt the pull of distraction, but I was no longer blind to the chains. I could see the battlefield, and for the first time, I understood my place in the fight. Months later, I found myself standing before a small group at my church, sharing my story openly for the first time. My voice trembled, but I spoke with honesty and conviction. When I finished, the room was silent. Then, one by one, people began to share their own struggles, their own chains. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emmanuel had been right. I didn't need to change the world overnight. All I needed was to plant seeds, to speak the truth, and to trust that even the smallest efforts could ripple outward in ways I might never see. And so, I continued, living, speaking, and breaking my own chains one day at a time. The mission was far from over, but I no longer faced it with fear. Instead, I carried with me the memory of that brilliant light, the warmth of Emmanuel's hand, and the assurance that I was loved, chosen, and capable of far more than I had ever believed. Leave your like, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's incredibly moving.